Hi, I'm Kieran and welcome back to Making Sense of Information Security. In this second lesson, I will introduce the two main approaches we use to work on information security. Before that though, let's think back on your Lesson 1 homework. One task you had was to identify some risks faced by your business, and I'm sure you found a few. As I mentioned before, security starts with a risk assessment, and that's what that homework was about. Not a complete risk assessment, of course, but getting you into a risk-based way of thinking. And as you will have discovered, there are plenty of risks, for example around people, where and how they work with information. So what do we do with risks once we find them? Well, we have a few options. There's only one option that's unacceptable, which is to ignore the risk. We know it's there now, and if we're serious about information security, we're not going to ignore it, right? So, what options are left? Sometimes we can deal with a risk by eliminating it, usually by stopping doing whatever it is that causes the risk. This is not always possible, but it is worth taking seriously. For example, I've seen many situations where companies run risks by gathering and storing more data than they need for their purpose. Risk aside, this may also be illegal. So do consider eliminating information security risks by eliminating some information altogether. Something else we can do is to transfer the risk to someone else, usually through insurance. Though cyber insurance usually comes with the requirement that we do what we can to reduce the risk. There are other ways of transferring risk, but do remember that you can't transfer responsibility. We may decide to accept the risk, which is not the same thing as ignoring it. You might decide, for example, to accept a low probability, low impact risk that would cost a lot of money to mitigate. When you accept a risk, though, you document it and you know how you will react if it should come to pass. We are left now with the most common option, which is to reduce or mitigate the risk. Our aim is to reduce the risk to a level where it becomes acceptable. So, how do we reduce or mitigate information security risks? Well, to reduce risks, we apply security controls. And we have two types of control in our armoury: technical and policy-based. A common example of a technical control is a system requirement to change your password every 90 days, which, by the way, is not always considered best practice these days. A policy-based control, on the other hand, is a rule, for example, that users should never share their passwords. Let's look first at technical controls. Technical controls are implemented by your IT department or support company, and they will involve restrictions on how equipment is used or how information is accessed or distributed. The key thing in your role is that you should be able to relate these controls to risks. You should be able to understand what information security risks are being addressed by the technical controls enforced by your IT people. And this is important because you need to be able to communicate to your users why the controls are there, especially when they find them inconvenient, which of course they will. It's also important because if you can see what risks are being addressed by the technical controls you have in place, it will be much easier for you to identify the risks that are not being mitigated by technical controls. And in Lesson 5, we'll take a more detailed look at some technical controls. You can achieve a lot with technical controls. You can manage any device and any information to a very detailed degree. There are a few problems though. Firstly, your IT people need to know how to implement the controls, and most don't, at least not in any great detail. And this is not surprising, and it's not a criticism. IT has always been mindful of security, but it's focused on giving access to information. A security focus involves a different mindset. The second problem is that unless your technical controls are very well planned and equally well implemented, they will irritate your users, perhaps to the point where management will demand that you remove them. And even if they are well planned and implemented, the closer you get to the impossible dream of perfect security, the more you will get in the way of your users doing their jobs. The biggest problem, though, is people just don't like being rigidly controlled. And can you blame them? It feels like you don't trust them. They might resent your controls, become uncooperative, and maybe they'll even fight back. And remember, these are the very people we need on side to get anywhere with information security. Generally, you want to try to avoid being too rigid with your technical controls. So you should discuss with your IT the technical controls you have and the ones that you need, and relate this to risk. But don't get stuck trying to find foolproof technical controls for every eventuality. You can't do it all with technical controls. And this, of course, is where policy comes in. Okay, to help us to think about how policies work, consider a common situation where you have some users working from home, connecting to your office system by VPN. Now, as you conducted your risk assessment and thought about home workers, you might have spotted some risks in need of mitigation. How, for example, are you going to make sure that other people in the user's home don't access your system if your user leaves their computer unattended while connected to your VPN? How are you going to make sure that the antivirus software on their home PC is kept up to date if it's not managed as part of your IT system? Now, you could spend a lot of time trying to figure out some technical controls with IT. You might find them, or you might never get there. Alternatively, you could add some lines to a home working policy to the effect that users must not leave their machines unattended without logging out, and they must keep their antivirus software up to date. So what good will this do? Well, even if these things seem obvious, they may not be obvious to your users, who of course have other things on their minds too. And as long as your users actually read your policies, or even better, if you go through the policies in detail with them, just having it written down will remind people and help them to follow the rules. People do like to follow rules if they know what they are. You shouldn't assume that your users have the same security concerns or knowledge that you have, and you shouldn't assume that anything is too obvious. Policies, in fact, make for very effective security measures. Policies must be written down, and staff must read and understand them. They must be reviewed and updated as circumstances change. They should be as short as possible while adequately covering their subject. Ideally, you should have one policy for each area of concern, such as a password policy, a mobile device use policy, an equipment disposal policy, and so on. Now, I regularly see two equally unsuccessful approaches to information security policies. The first one, they're written by lawyers or legal consultants, people who are not experts in your business. These policies are often legally very good, and they can be useful for HR or disciplinary matters, but they're generally useless in terms of information security, both because no one outside HR ever reads them and because they don't address technical realities. The other unsuccessful approach is where they're written by technical experts, though still not experts on your business. These policies tend to have a lot of clauses covering all the possibilities. For example, for remote working scenarios, they cover every possible combination of self-supplied or business-owned equipment. Again, they're usually unreadable, largely irrelevant, and have zero impact on information security. So who should write your policies? Yes, you've guessed it, you should. An effective information security policy needs to be specific to your business, written in language understood by your staff, and covering the exact circumstances in which your users work. And you need to road test your policies. You need a few trusted users to test your policies against the reality of how your staff work. You'll find you need several drafts before your policy addresses reality and covers as many eventualities as possible. And here's a golden rule. If your policy refers to anything that is not 100% true, then your users will treat your policy as 100% fantasy, and they'll ignore it because they'll assume you're not serious. So don't, for example, say something like this: only company supplied equipment may be used to access company data. If the reality is that everybody, or even anybody, can receive company emails on their personal smartphones. Writing information security policies is the perfect way to reality check your own understanding of how the business works, what technical controls you need, and whether it's feasible to apply them. And remember, policies are always a work in progress. As soon as version 1 is finished, it's time to start thinking about version 2, because at a minimum, you will have forgotten something. Okay, that was a lot to take in. You must be wondering how much work you're getting into. Well, let me try to give you a sense of it. I would allow about 2 weeks to write, test, review, and then publicise an information security policy. And you'll need some help to do it in that time. So I'm assuming that you're not focused exclusively on information security. You could do it in a few days if that was your sole focus, but I'm guessing that you're doing information security alongside a lot of other things. So to get started, as ever, you start with a risk assessment. The worksheet for this lesson is going to help you to develop your understanding of risk by exploring risk reduction or mitigation, and if you haven't written one before, it's going to get you started on writing your first information security policy. So thank you very much for watching. I look forward to seeing you for the next lesson. For now, bye and good luck.